Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Let's Disagree and Other Interesting Conversations with Kolby Reddish. My name is Kolby Reddish, and today I am joined by a friend of mine, Troy Leavitt. Troy, I am so excited to have a very interesting conversation with you today about free will and the compatibilist view of free will. This is something I think I encountered a few years ago, and I know I've seen you post about it from time to time, and super happy that you reached out. Anything you want to say to kind of introduce yourself and what we'll be talking about today?
Well, first of all, I just want to say thanks for having me on your show. I actually feel very fortunate to be here at the kind of the instigation of the great Kolby Reddish show, because I think over time this channel's going places. That's
Thank you.
I really appreciate that you're willing to have conversations about things where they might be a little bit more contentious or places where people have different opinions. And free will is one of those places. And so when you started your channel and I realized that there was so many discussions happening about free will out there in the Mormon sphere, that I saw an opportunity to say, well, maybe Kolby will be a willing victim to listen to me evangelize a bit about compatibilism and my views on free will. Just as background, I don't really consider myself ex-Mormon in the standard sense, because I've been out of the church about 30 years or something. And so I don't really view Mormonism as that fresh, right? Because I haven't really believed in it a long time. But I do find kind of the modern Mormon way that apologists are interfacing with stuff and the modern Mormon kind of discussion really quite fascinating, just from a standpoint of anthropology, like what's happening to the church as it's become more and more corporate and that sort of thing. So my interest in the church isn't necessarily to attack it. It's more to understand it and to understand kind of where people are coming to it. So I'm kind of in a weird position where I'm not really in the ex-Mormon camp, but I often associate with you guys who are really kind of deconstructing Mormonism. Sure. So there's my background, I guess.
Yeah. And it's probably pretty interesting to you, because I think I remember from some of the conversations we've had just offline in the background that you were pretty plugged into like the new atheist movement when it was originally happening. And so it's probably pretty interesting to you to see like some of these same arguments that you've seen theists and atheists make 20 years ago. Now I kind of feel like Mormon apologetics, especially online Mormon apologetics, are basically kind of confronting some of these same problems that like other theists have had to for the last 2 decades. Does it feel that way to you, having kind of been?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. It does feel very much like, at least in the kind of ex-Mormon sphere, that it's always almost at a lag behind what I would say kind of that main religious take on the country is, or it always feels like it's dragging just a little bit behind, kind of playing catch up. And so I feel like the ex-Mormon sphere is still in the wake of kind of that new atheist movement that happened around, 2005, whatever it was, right in the area. Yeah.
Yeah, that totally makes sense to me. I believe, as the poet once said, all of this has happened before and all of it will happen again.
Yes.
Well, I'll go ahead and pull up our slides today. And I truthfully am super excited for this conversation. When you reached out and said we'd be talking about compatibilism, this is something I've heard, for the last several years, and it felt like it really aligns with my experience thinking about and talking about free will. So I'm really excited to talk about some of these ideas, because I think you've done a really good job of synthesizing, like you have here, evangelizing compatibilism, talking about the reasons that this is probably a good alternative worldview when people start confronting these issues, philosophical and theological issues about free will.
Yeah. I think that especially when people are leaving their religion, their faith, and they come in and they discover that in a lot of the scientific world, you'll hear about, well, there is no free will at all. And that's a hard thing to wrap your head around, especially if you're coming from a religious perspective where it's all about free will and agency. And now you're getting told from a scientific, it appears, perspective, oh, no, you don't have free will. It can be very depressing. And so I, without giving too much background, I really did kind of exist in that camp of not believing there was any free will after, Sam Harris and reading that stuff. But then I started thinking about it, and the more that I read and reflected on it, I started to say, well, actually, I think there are some issues with the incompatibilist view, and that really free will does exist, but you have to have reasonable understanding and definitions about what you're talking about. And that's really the issue. As over time I started to realize it's more about the definitions and how you're using free will, what free will is, and how we can make sense of the concept. And so I'm an evangelist now for compatibilism, which is the position that, you do have free will, but you just have to think a little bit harder about what that means than kind of the snap judgment of everything is causally determined all the way down. And so there's no way for you to have free will. Anyway, so with that kind of background, hopefully these slides will set things up in a fun and interesting way and inspire some discussion along the way. But at the end of the day, I'm hoping that when people go through this little presentation, they have an understanding of the different types of free will, kind of as philosophers talk about it. And even if you disagree with me, you at least have kind of a better understanding of the landscape, that you know what people are talking about and why compatibilism is the majority position among professional philosophers, right? It's not a minority position. It is what most people believe in philosophy, even though it seems like once you leave the philosophical circles, a lot of people slip into the idea that if you're scientifically minded, you can't have free will, which...
Right. Well, and I think the thing that's really interesting to me is that the people who have that opinion, right, that if you're scientifically minded, you can't believe in free will, are almost always the people who don't actually have that kind of scientific worldview, right? It's not scientists who think this, as you've talked about with the survey data we'll get to here in just a second. It's usually people who, like for apologetic purposes or just other reasons, seem to present kind of what they view as the natural consequences of believing in like materialism. And I know we'll talk about some of these terms as we go throughout. But there are a lot of people who believe if you believe in materialism and you don't believe in like mind-body dualism, that you necessarily cannot believe in free will. And I think from my perspective, the reason I started encountering compatibilist theories and kind of talking and reading a little bit about it was precisely because I wanted to better understand the argument. So I think that's where, even though I don't know, we'll have a whole lot of disagreement, going along with the theme of the show on these topics. I do think it will present a very interesting case study for people to kind of look at an argument, whether they accept it or not, like you said, is a different question. But just to better understand, they're like legitimate reasons that some pretty heavy hitting thinkers in this field look at it this way. And so at bare minimum, I guess I would hope that we hear a little less of the straw manning of, if you're a materialist, you cannot believe in free will, because that just irritates me anytime I hear it. So
yes, and it's completely inaccurate too, because we can see that the numbers do not support that. So
exactly.
All right, let's dive in then. So
perfect.
On our next slide here. So the one thing I wanted to point out, so David Hume is probably one of the very earliest compatibilists, or at least, talking this way. And the thing that I wanted to point out is that this is a long-standing contentious issue in philosophy. It's not brand new. It didn't like suddenly get invented once we started to do brain scans or something, which is sometimes treated like that, But no, this goes way, way back. And, clear back to the Greeks. And the thing that I wanted to point out is that terminology and some of these things have changed a little bit over time, so that when David Hume or these older philosophers talk about free will, they'll often talk about liberty, which they mean for free will, and necessity, which they mean for kind of no free will, what is causally determined. I just wanted to point that out. That's why I highlighted it here in this slide, that this contentious question of metaphysics, you can read about it from David Hume in his book Of Liberty and Necessity, or his section on Inquiry on Human Understanding. And that's what it's really about, is about free will. And also liberty reflects itself in what we now talk about free will as libertarian free will, is the type of free will that most people want to have, which is that free will that comes from outside the system. So I just kind of wanted to make sure that we have this understanding that when we talk about libertarian free will in a second, we're not talking about libertarian political philosophy or anything. We're talking about this long-standing tradition of people having the liberty to have free will and do things. So I just wanted to make sure we understand a little bit that there's a history here.
Right. And when we use that term, like libertarian free will, so I know you just said it's like the ability to make a choice from outside of the system. Is there kind of any other definition you would want people to think about when we talk about libertarian free will that you feel like fits and does a good job of providing that definition?
Yeah, I think in a couple slides, I'm going to break out
We've got one.
the different, the different views of free will.
Perfect.
But I wanted to set this up with something kind of fun. So I'm a big fan of Futurama. And so season 9, episode 9, there's an episode called Free Will Hunting, which you can get the joke, right? It's actually Bender goes on a hunt for free will. And anyway, so this is the setup, these kind of things from Free Will or from Futurama, where Bender gets accused. And hopefully we don't have any problems with copyright, but I think this is a good way to look at it.
Bender Rodriguez, you are charged with petty larceny, possession of something analogous to drugs, and assault with a smelly weapon. How do you plead?
Not guilty. Although I did do it. That's right, I'm bad.
Due to the overwhelming nature.
All right, so that's the first 17 seconds.
Yeah.
So there's a little setup there where, Bender wants to be found not guilty, but at the same time, he wants everybody to think he's a badass because he got away with, doing all these things. And so already he's in that, this is the character of Bender in the show too, is that he's always trying to impress his friends by kind of this petty criminal pranky behavior. And so he's finally been caught. And now he's in court. And I actually like this because we're in court where the rubber hits the road, right? We're going to find out if this guy's guilty or not. So let's go with the free will defense that Bender's lawyer presents.
Perfect.
Closing statements.
Your Honor, the state's case contains not one Kentucky kernel of truth, resting as it does on the contention that my client made a series of bad decisions. However, my client made no such decisions.
But by your client's own admission.
You see, Bender here is what is known in scientific circles as a robot, a mere automaton whose behavior is pre-programmed by his software. He has no free will. He cannot decide to engage in criminal behavior. How can you convict him for his actions when he lacks the free will to undertake those actions?
Right. So there's the free will defense. And actually that's very similar to the sort of defense or the explanation you often hear people talk about with free will. Well, nobody's really responsible for their actions because it's all predetermined by your programming from neurons, a background, to genetics and everything else. So there's no space for free will to get into the system. This is kind of the way that, and it stands out in Futurama here because Bender's a robot specifically.
Right.
Yeah.
It is very, that in my past, I used to be a criminal prosecutor. So my mind's immediately thinking about there are categories of crimes where I guess if you could prove that you don't have any free will, like you were a robot, that it actually would mean that you cannot be liable for that crime because there's this idea in criminal law of mens rea, or the criminal intent that's required for certain types of crimes. And for some crimes, intent is completely irrelevant. For other types of crimes, intent is a required element that the state must prove to prove you guilty. So it is a really interesting kind of, not only just a theory about free will, but kind of raises a lot of interesting implications for the legal system, obviously, also. Okay, I'll keep going to the end of the clip here.
I'm awake. I'm awake.
Order. Counselor, I am a robot myself. Are you suggesting that any verdict I reach is simply the output of a pre-programmed...
Computation complete.
No.
You did it, Bender. You got away with things.
Did I, Fry? Did I? What's the point of living if I don't have free will? From now on, no matter what cool crimes I commit, people will say, Bender didn't do that. It was just Bender's programming. Well, I committed these crimes. Do you hear me? I'm guilty!
Bailiffs, get that innocent robot out of my courtroom.
Guilty!
Oh, that was funny.
All right. Yeah, so that's the setup for the episode where, Bender now wants to prove that he is capable of being guilty. And the whole rest of the show is about him trying to prove that he has free will in spite of being a robot. And of course, shenanigans ensue. But it's very clever setup to kind of point out this is the same issues that we're dealing with in our courtrooms today about how much liability we put with somebody. Like you said, there are issues where you're like, the amount of free will or intention they had really figures into the criminal proceedings that follow and whether or not they're guilty. So it's like real world touching, but still kind of clever, I guess.
Yeah,
all right,
for sure. Let me go to the next slide. Perfect.
Yeah, and these are kind of the three main points that I think we get out of free will. The first one is the same one we just saw with Bender: moral responsibility, the question of whether or not you can actually be held responsible for it. Also, whether praise or blame. It's also the good side of things too for free will. Like if you do something right or good, do you reserve praise or should be blamed for it? And ultimately, are we fated or free? Do we have any say in what happens to us as we go throughout life? So these are big, deep questions, right? And I can totally understand why this is such a contentious issue in philosophy, but also, as we just saw, potentially in law and other areas of our life. It's not just an academic exercise. It really impacts everything we do.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, like you talked about, there are tons of criminal questions that require kind of understanding somebody's intent. And I think that's one of the reasons I got really interested in this after my faith deconstruction, is I wanted to better understand kind of what philosophy and then even neuroscience, like what it says about these questions.
Right. So this is this clip that I included from Hayden Carroll, who has his channel over there, Let's Talk with Hayden Carroll, where he does, drive-bys. People come by and they stop at his table and he asks them a bunch of questions. And I've noticed he's basically following a certain script with those people that he feels are atheists, where he lays out, well, if you're an atheist, a materialist, basically is what he's saying, you must accept these things. There are inescapable implications, and one of them is no free will. Anyway, so I wanted to include this clip straight from how free will is being discussed by opponents of it, or at least for those who think that they might be materialist opponents of it, like Hayden. And then maybe we can talk a little bit about what's going on with that.
Yeah, and I think one thing that would be interesting for people is to listen to, it's always interesting to me when someone is telling you the inescapable implications of what you believe. So one of the things that we've done on this channel is we've looked at some common logical fallacies and kind of like thinking problems. I'd be interested to see, as people listen to this clip, if they can see kind of the same problems that you and I see that we'll talk about after it.
Okay, that's fine. The part about being stupid, my arguments are: you have to say their consciousness is an illusion, which I think most people would disagree with. You have to say there's no free will, which most people would disagree with. Yeah. You have to say there's no basis for or justification for morality, which most people would say is not true. Is that it? That might be the three. No, there's one other one. Yeah. Morality, free will, consciousness, and I can't remember what the other one is. Why am I spacing? I haven't talked about it. Purpose. Yeah. Most people are not nihilists. Most people have purpose in their lives. But the atheism, if you don't have free will, you don't choose your purpose, or you don't choose what you do. You're reacting to the chemicals in your brain. So you get nihilism. Yeah. So that's what it is: consciousness, morality, free will, and nihilism. Yeah. But those are not arguments. Those are implications of atheism. Yeah. Yeah.
There you go. Oh, spelled it out for us exactly.
He nailed it.
Yeah.
So Troy, as an atheist, you must, I guess, believe that your life has no purpose. You have no morality. You're not conscious. At least it's just an illusion, and you have no free will. That's the logical implications of our worldview, I guess.
Hayden has set me straight.
You had it there on the slide, but just since we talked about introducing this, thinking about the logical fallacies, it's an obvious fallacy when someone is telling you the implications of your worldview. That's what's known as the straw man fallacy, right? They're creating this straw man that then they find more easy to defeat than the actual strongest version of the arguments against their position. And it's just such a dead giveaway of someone engaging in a straw man when they're telling someone else the implications of the worldview that they don't have, because they may just have a misunderstanding of what that worldview actually says.
Yeah, I appreciate. So one of the things I appreciate about what Hayden's doing here is you can tell he's got a script, right? He's got these checkpoints, and he's actually trying to remember. There's 4 things to my straw man that I need to set out, and he couldn't remember the 4th, so he has to go and look. Oh, that's right, they don't have purpose. And that's kind of what I've noticed a lot of the apologetics are doing here with the free will argument, is they have a straw man that they set up, and then they strangle the heck out of that straw man. They really just say, see, this is crazy. It's stupid. Atheism is dumb. But they're not really engaging with what it is that somebody who may have a more atheistic or materialistic viewpoint might have. The thing is, and this is also to Hayden's credit, there are some atheists who do have all 4 of those positions, right? So, but the thing is I think they're a minority position, And when you represent that this is the inescapable implications, what you're doing is really badly misrepresenting the opposition position that you're trying to criticize. And so you end up not really having any effect,
Right.
in my opinion, right? My whole point here is he's what do they call it? Preaching to the choir. You're basically just
Right.
trying to reinforce your own beliefs without approaching any better understanding of truth or even your opponent's position. You've actually pushed them into the corner. You have to believe this. And if you do anything different, then I'm going to argue with you in defense of my straw man, which is kind of wild. Yeah.
Yeah, there's also a lot of equivocation going on in that
Yes.
clip, in the sense that he is saying, when he says there's no morality, which is the way he said it, what he really means is there's no objective morality. And we can have probably a different conversation about that question itself, but it's interesting that he's smuggling in that lack of the objective word to say, like, the clear implications of what he's saying and the way he phrased it is that if you're an atheist, if you don't share his opinion, that you cannot have a moral code, which is just patently ridiculous. Even Hayden doesn't believe that.
Yes.
But that's that's one of the reasons that people engage in straw men, is they want to use those straw man arguments to basically scare people away from that opposing point of view.
Right. To make it look kind of ridiculous up front. Yeah.
Exactly.
And I agree with you when he says no morality, and he will say no objective morality. And sometimes the thing is, after having talked to him, a lot of times they're not really dealing with even objective morality. They're dealing with cosmic morality, something that exists completely separate from humanity. They take it way out there, because you can have various forms of objective morality that are simple, like speed limits, kind of a form of objective morality. You hit this number, you're in violation. So that's, you can have kind of more local objective morality, but they're talking cosmic. They're talking something that outside of humanity that makes all the judgments about what's right and what's wrong in some way, in my opinion. Yeah.
Right. So let's talk about Dan Dennett.
Yeah. So after we just shown what straw manning is about, I wanted to talk a lot about Dan Dennett. Dan Dennett is my favorite of the horsemen of the new atheists. So there were 4 of them, and he recently died. And his death actually is what prompted me to start wanting to make some videos talking about free will and stuff, because I realized his position was kind of being lost in the, I'd say, the normal zeitgeist, right? A lot of his positions on things are a little deeper, a little more reflective, a little more, you have to spend some time really getting to dig into what you're talking about before you start saying, oh, now I see, and this makes a lot more sense than kind of those quick, glib responses.
It's also odd.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, it's also odd to me that just having come later than you to the 4 horsemen, it's interesting to me that Dennett is definitely the one that is talked about the least. But I think many of his ideas are actually, like you just said, the deepest and some of the most interesting, that challenged me the most.
Yeah, my opinion on Dan Dennett is he doesn't really fit in with the other 3 quite as well, because he was probably the least hostile to religion in general. He was, over in the philosophy thing, and in his book, Breaking the Spell, was more about understanding religion as a natural phenomenon. Is it something that happens to humans, and how do we make sense of that phenomenon? Not about, we need to eradicate religion, which the other new atheists had more of that leaning, like religion is mostly bad. And he was like, well, religion's a mixed bag and we should study it. So he was a little different to begin with. But the point I wanted to get at here with Dennett's rules is that if you want to really arrive at truth, if you want to be serious about understanding the universe, the best thing to do is to steel man your opponent as strongly as you can, so that you're always dealing with the best arguments. And that way you're always, it's kind of like you're always fighting the best. You're always engaged with the top. And to that end, his Dennett's rules, which are actually also known as Rappaport's rules, are the rules of engagement for when you're dealing with a point of disagreement. And so I don't know, maybe you can just kind of read through these, so that I don't do all the talking, and let's
of course.
discuss the value. Sure.
Yeah, so Dennett basically offered these 4 rules for engagement, and I like a lot of these. He says, number 1, attempt to re-express your target's position so clearly, vividly, and fairly that your target says, thanks, I wish I'd thought of it that way. This is the core principle, a strong form of steel manning. Restate their view in its best, most accurate light to show genuine comprehension rather than caricature. And I think like you said, the advantage here is even if you don't ultimately end up sharing your interlocutor's point of view, you want to be sure that you like actually understand what you're engaging with and what you're deciding that you don't believe. So, one of the reasons I've done as much counter apologetic stuff as I have is this rule exactly, is I want, if people are going to believe certain things that require a lot of sacrifice from them, I want them to understand the reason that people don't share that view, and basically so that they can understand the difference between the things they believe on faith and the things they believe based on evidence. I'll go ahead and continue here.
Sure.
Number 2, list any points of agreement, especially if they are not matters of general or widespread agreement. Highlight common ground to reduce polarization and remind both sides of shared foundations. So I don't know if it's just me coming from the legal field, but I very much take the view in these types of conversations that goes along with the second rule that like I should be willing to concede anything that doesn't actually get to like our substantive disagreement. Like so many times you see discussions online or discussions between people that break down at like the fundamental, like definitional level. Like they just don't have the same definitions of words. And it's odd to me because you can just agree to someone else's definition of a term for purposes of one conversation. And it's just odd to me to see that like break down so often amongst other adults. Do you have any thoughts about that, or should I go on to number 3?
No, I agree very much with that's a kind of a tactic. I think when definitions, of course, are very important when you're discussing something, but at the same time, if somebody starts to get hung up on the definition as a way not to engage with the argument, then you start to suspect, well, I think maybe you don't really have a good opposition here. You don't really have a good argument. You're just trying to obfuscate and drag us off into definitional territory. So I agree with you that if you're actually wanting to engage with an argument, it's perfectly acceptable to say, for the time of our conversation, let's use your definition, just so that we can move ahead. And it's also like that second rule there. It's a way of showing a bit of good faith that you're willing to, all right, for this conversation, let's presume that you're correct with this and then move ahead.
Exactly. Yep. So great rule for furthering good conversation. Number 3, mention anything you have learned from your target. Acknowledge insights or value gained from their perspective, which signals humility and openness. Again, I think it shows, like you said, it's a good mark of good faith engagement. Do you have any more thoughts on 3, or I'll go to 4?
One of the things that I've noticed, this is kind of funny to me, but Dennett refers to the person you're talking to as your target. And he does it a couple times in here. And I just thought that was kind of a funny way to your target as opposed to, your interlocutor or something, or I don't know. Your conversation partner. Your target. Yeah.
Target does sound a little bit more aggressive probably than a term I would use, I guess. Number 4, only then are you permitted to say only then are you permitted to say so much as a word of rebuttal or criticism. Criticism comes last after the above steps have built rapport and demonstrated fairness, making it far more likely to be taken seriously and advance the conversation productively. Yeah, I think those are just great rules for engagement. And I think aside from the interesting discussion about free will, those pieces in particular really resonate with what we're trying to create in this channel, which is a space that people can have those types of conversations. So I think those are great.
All right. I also want to set that up because I'm going to be arguing a little bit against incompatibilism and that there is no free will, but I want to make sure that I treat it fairly. And so we'll treat that first before we get into compatibilism, so you can see the contrast. And I will try and treat it in a way that maybe you'll go, oh, well, the incompatibilists, they're right, So part of playing by Dennett's rules is making sure you're talking about the opposing positions in a robust way that they themselves hopefully would say, yeah, okay, that is what I believe. Not a Hayden Carroll way of, no, most atheists would disagree with your characterization. Yeah.
Right.
All right. So this is a good question because I realize when we talk about free will, pretty soon you start going, I don't even know exactly what it is that we're talking about. So I grabbed this definition from the American Heritage Dictionary, mostly because I think it's all kind of bad definitions, that if you read these definitions and walk through them, you'll find at the end, I still don't know how to identify free will when I see it. Like, how would I know? So maybe let's look at these definitions and then talk about the problems that we have with just kind of the generic zeitgeist definition of free will that you might find in a dictionary.
Great. I'll read the first one. The ability or discretion to choose, free choice.
Yeah, what does that tell you, right? There's okay, I guess you have the ability. That I don't know. That, to me,
it's almost tautological. It's almost
Yes.
like defining, like to define free will as free choice. Those to me are synonyms. So the definition isn't adding any value to my understanding. Usually what I'm looking for in a definition is something that's like an operative definition that helps me actually understand the term. Defining a term by a synonym isn't helping me understand the term, because then I'd have to go look up, well, what does free choice say, right? I guess that's why they have the first part of the definition. But again, the first part of the definition is just the definition of free choice. So it feels very tautological to me.
Yeah, that's a good, it's tautological. It's a great way to put it. It's just referencing itself. Free will is free will like stuff. It doesn't really tell you. The second one, at first it seems better, but I think when you look at it a little more closely, it starts to fall apart. So anyway, let's look at that second one.
Yeah, the power of making choices that are neither determined by natural causality nor predestined by fate or divine will.
So I put my note out to the side, which says, if natural causality, fate, and divine will are all excluded, what's left? How would you know? How would you identify free will if you saw it? Well, that wasn't causal. What the heck? How can you even have something that's non-causal by natural causality and there's no fate and no free will? It sounds to me like they're defining something that you're not going to be able to identify that you've discovered. Like, what is it? But there it is as a definition.
Right. It also prompts the question to me, and again, this is kind of a larger conversation. It's always related when we talk about free will. In my mind, it's always very connected when we talk about free will and we talk about consciousness. But when I see that term, things that are neither determined by natural causality, that to me goes, what do you mean by natural causality? Because do you mean like that extends all the way back to the Big Bang Theory? That's what like indeterminists, or I'm sorry, that's what determinists and incompatibilists typically kind of see it. Like they see the natural causality stretching back that far. But I guess my point is, and this kind of goes to your comment, there's different views on natural causality, right? And it, to me, it just kind of is shifting the conversation to a different conversation. Now you need to talk about how far back does natural causality actually go, and how far should we view it in the context of free will?
Yes, and I think you're doing a good job of pointing out some of the problems that you have with that incompatibilist, what's sometimes called a hard determinist position, right, where you're taking it all the way back to the Big Bang. Everything at such a causal, interwoven web that there's absolutely no way to think about it other than this. I guess a way to think of it is all the outcomes of the World Cups were determined at the Big Bang, right? That sort of way of thinking is sometimes thought of as, a scientific reductionist. You've taken it all the way to the point where it starts to look absurd. And,
the other way I've heard it phrased, and hopefully this agrees with what you just said, the other way I've heard it phrased is like, if we did understand the chemicals that led to us having consciousness, like we understood all of the complicated things about the brain that we really are just kind of not, that we fully don't understand yet, could we basically calculate out, if we knew the position of every single electron in the universe, could we calculate out basically everything that's going to happen? That's the way I've heard hard determinism kind of phrased.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. There was a mathematician, Laplace, who actually had Laplace's demon, right? The idea that if you had a demon who knew everything in the universe and knew all the natural causes, could predict with perfect accuracy everything that would happen forevermore. And it's kind of a thought experiment.
Right.
But not necessarily real. That's it's a clever way to think about things. All right.
Okay. Should I read the third one?
Sure.
A person's natural inclination, unforced choice.
Yeah. Again, kind of there's some indication of what we might call free will there, but their natural inclination, it's kind of, you got to do what you wanted to do, I guess. Another way to state that, something like that. Again, the point of this slide is basically to say that our kind of normal definitions of free will come up kind of short. when we
Right.
walk them through and we start thinking about free will, it's hard to really wrap your mind around what is it we're even talking about. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide.
Perfect.
Where now we can talk a little bit more about, these are kind of the three actual definitions or stances regarding free will that I think we can start to break out, have some definitions around, and then talk about and what they are. So basically there are three general ones. And I want to add that these are kind of broad strokes. I'm trying to, consolidate a lot of ideas into just these general categories. But the first one is the libertarian view that we've talked about, and is incompatibilist, means that whatever free will is, it exists independent of the material universe. This is the notion of the ghost in the machine. So you've got a spirit that's actually doing all of your deciding. So anytime you talk about libertarian free will, you're talking about an incompatibilist position where you recognize it's not happening inside the material universe. It's coming from outside the material universe through a spirit or an intelligence or whatever you want to call it. Panpsychism might be there too. And it seeps in somehow and makes the choices through kind of a metaphysical means. That's typically the libertarian view.
Okay, great. Do you want me to read the naturalist / incompatibilist view, the middle one?
Sure.
So we've got here no free will. All is the result of the inevitable machinations of the material universe, kind of like we just talked about. If we knew the position of every single particle, could we calculate out everything that's going to happen? In that view, then, we're just machines of fate. We do not have free will, and that's why it's called the incompatibilist view.
Yes. And the two things, so libertarian and naturalist, are both incompatibilist views, which so the libertarian view is usually what a religious person has, right? A metaphysical view. And then this incompatibilist materialist view is what a lot of your neuroscientists like Sam Harris, Robert Sapolsky, that we're going to talk about, they have adopted that view, but they're alike in that they both say, well, it has to be metaphysical in nature, generally speaking. It can't have come from inside the system.
Right. And then the incompatibilist naturalist view says, and I don't believe that there's that additional level of reality, so we believe that there is no free will, right?
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
Yep.
We see no evidence for a spirit, therefore it's wait, let's do that last one.
Oh, yeah,
so this is my stance. My stance in the compatibilist view, which is that free will does exist, and it is compatible with and born from. It's actually, you have to live in a material determinist universe for compatibilist free will to have evolved, is basically the idea that free will is a product of evolution, just like some of our other capacities that we've developed. And so it's actually the ability to make choices is something we've evolved the capacity to do, and it becomes compatible. Anyway, so this is the idea of evolved freedom engines, that we as humans do have certain amounts of free will, but it's limited free will. It's not this like wild metaphysical free will. It's like, oh, we've evolved some certain capacities to make choices that are meaningful enough, sufficient enough that we can have moral responsibility, praise and blame, and all these things that we've talking about, even in a completely determined universe. And in order to be able to see that, we have to talk a little bit more about what these different viewpoints are.
Yeah. Just so I make sure that I'm not, in my head, straw manning different positions, help me understand, does usually someone's view of free will follow on from their view of the arising of consciousness, or are there different views on that? Or is this what that slide was speaking to?
There are different views on that. There are kind of some general trends, right? A lot of materialist viewpoints on consciousness. If you think consciousness is a material process, you do tend to go towards the no free will incompatibilist. If you're a neuroscientist, like you see this a lot, the neuroscientist. However, if you're a philosopher like Dan Dennett, who is just as hardcore on the materialist view, he's got a different approach to free will. And so, that you can have different attentions, different opinions of what consciousness is, or even the same, and have still different opinions of what free will is. So in other words, Sam Harrison, all the new atheists are all going to be in the same camp of materialists, right?
Yeah.
But
so in other words,
Sam
they're
Harris
like,
and Dan Dennett,
So in other words, they're like related questions, but your answer on the question of where does consciousness come from is not necessarily dispositive on your answer regarding free will. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
But I do think they're very closely related. It's a really good question. In fact, a little bit later, we start to talk about the consciousness stuff and how it relates to free will. But hopefully so far we're starting to shape up where we're headed with the conversation, that we've broken things down now into some areas that we can talk about a little more respectively. So this is from a 2020 Phil Paper survey, and I wanted to include this because I see a lot of these notions that incompatibilists, no free will is like the dominant position that most scientists have or most philosophers have, and it is not. This is a 2020 Phil Paper survey conducted by David Bourget and David Chalmers, where they just basically asked professional philosophers who deal with issues of free will to rank themselves. Where do you come down on this? And it's really interesting when they did this and got about 1,800 responses, that the far and away the majority view is the compatibilist view that we're gonna speak to here in a moment. But this is what most philosophers actually believe. So if you're saying that, this isn't a viable position, you're kind of going against the academic consensus to begin with, which I don't think a lot of people know. They're just unaware of that. Yeah.
Right. And I'd say, I mean, just to the clip we played earlier from Hayden, if literally the majority view is this view, and yet you're saying that it's like a necessary entailment of atheism, and I get that we don't know the religious background of these professors that were surveyed, but we also are going to be able to like guess and use a stand-in that most of them probably are going to align atheistically. It just is odd to me to say that the majority position is something that you can't have, which is the way I'm understanding Hayden's clip. Am I misunderstanding? That just seems very odd to me.
Yes. And to me, that was the exactly the point that I wanted to make, that he is kind of forcing a straw man of a position that's not really held very, very widely. And he's trying to say, but you have to hold this straw man or I can't continue with my script, guys.
He's literally presenting he's literally presenting a minority position. Like you can see here, 11.4% say no free will. He's presenting the 11.4% opinion as the only valid opinion. It's not only the minority opinion, it's the extreme minority position. Anyways, that's just kind of wild to me.
Yeah, and I think it's good to point that out for Hayden, but it's also worthwhile pointing out that a lot of our friends here in the ex-Mormon community are also in the same camp. I believe that Brittany Hartley and Bill Reel and maybe Carol Burrell and several of these people, I've heard them say, "Oh, there's no free will," because they've read these books by Sapolsky and Sam Harris and have been convinced that this is the position what we're at. That's why I want to evangelize. Well, a different position is worth looking at, this compatibilist position. All right. So I think we've shaped things up. Now let's keep cruising along. So first, I want to very briefly address libertarian free will. We're not going to spend too much time there, but this is just the idea that I think we've already somewhat covered so that people understand what it is and what we'll be dismissing basically for the rest of the discussion, because we'll be dealing with the compatibilism, incompatibilism arguments on the atheist side. Right. Anyway, so when we talk libertarian free will, I want to also point out how compelling it is. Libertarian free will really does have that sense of it's intuitive, because it's that Descartes notion of I think, therefore I am. I can feel my consciousness inside my head. That is really me, this consciousness experience. And so that makes me feel like my mind and my body are separate things. That they're two things, and my brain or my mind is somehow controlling my body, but somehow unrelated to it. And that is kind of the feeling that we have. The self is like disembodied consciousness. But if you're being scientific about it, there is no clear indication of spirit or other, ghost or anything. So this is not a viable path for anybody who's in a materialist direction. So,
right. In other words, the mind-body dualism, if we're just looking at scientific evidence, right, we're not necessarily willing to believe like spiritual claims or supernatural claims. Mind-body dualism has so far been not evidenced. And so that's what you're talking about, right? Scientifically, we have no reason to believe in a ghost in the machine.
Right. Yes.
Right.
Exactly. Okay.
Great. Done with this one?
With that behind us. And basically what we just said is that naturalism rejects this Cartesian dualism, right?
People can tell that I've reviewed these slides ahead of time because I keep going right where we're about to go.
Well, that's a good thing, because what that means is it's kind of hanging together maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that is the notion that you are entirely the processes of your brain, and the incompatibilist view is the natural processes preclude free will, where compatibilism is the natural processes include free will. You can actually have free will as a result of these processes, that it's actually part of what you're doing there. But it's both positions reject that Cartesian dualism.
Right.
Part of, well, maybe it's on the next slide. Let's go ahead and just because that's a quick one. Yeah, this next slide actually takes from that notion of Cartesian dualism and realizes that you've kind of got definitions of free will that start to split. And once you see what's going on with the definitions, you start to see why you're getting different opinions on what's going on here. And this is actually taken me years to recognize, actually, that a lot of it is just kind of the definitions of what you adopt for free will really influence. So it's really your premises will really start to carry forward how you think about free will. So to that end, let's take a quick look at what I think these definitions do. So maybe look first at incompatibilism and then at compatibilism.
Great. So I'll read incompatibilism. Metaphysical orientation. Free will must be a deep, reality-altering power, ultimate origination, absolute alternatives that probes the fundamental nature of causation, possibility, and being. The debate becomes about what the universe really permits. Yeah, I think that is very accurate from listening to incompatibilists. I mean, I know we'll talk about Sam Harris's book on this question, and I've listened to a bunch of lectures he's done related to that book. But yeah, I think that's exactly, just to give you credit, you're not straw manning that position. That's exactly the way I've heard it phrased by one of the champions kind of that view.
Yeah, and I think it's a fair view that if you take that as your premise, this deep reality altering power, yeah, you don't see evidence for it, therefore you're incompatible. I see the logic behind it. And as I said before, it's very compelling. Also because it's kind of easy to get. You kind of get, oh, yeah, there's no way for it to get in there, right? On the other hand, compatibilism is a pragmatic orientation. This is a bit more of like, well, we're going to talk about what free will really means to us as humans rather than trying to look like in between the atoms for something. So we're going to start pragmatically with how we use it in day-to-day life and what it means. In that instance, free will is a workable, evolved capacity for reasoned, uncoerced action that supports responsibility and human purposes. So the debate then shifts to what definitions best serve ethics, science, and lived experience. So it makes it much more about a human approach to free will and what free will means for us and our experience of it, rather than kind of a metaphysical quest to find something that might be breaking causality. And
yeah,
I
was just going to say, it is so interesting that basically what it comes down to is almost like they're talking about the term free will differently. Like a compatibilist view requires you to rethink what free will entails versus the incompatibilist view. And I guess we see this in the origin, the way you had it broken down, like the slide or two before that. Let me go back there because this is interesting. The libertarian free will view and the naturalist incompatibilist view, like you said, they're both incompatibilist because they cannot see free will operating inside of that natural system. I guess it's interesting that they answered that question the same way and then just answered the follow-on question then a different way. It's just an interesting thing to look at it like that, to me.
I do want to kind of give a little bit of leeway to the incompatibilists. In fact, we're going to be talking about their position in some depth here to make sure that we steelman it. But it is a logical thing to arrive at if you accept those premises, if you accept sort of a metaphysical premise. And that's where I think why it's so compelling, especially when you're leaving a religion, you're giving up all these metaphysical ideas and free will starts to feel, oh, it's just another thing I've got to give up because it's metaphysical in nature. And thankfully, we've got philosophers like Dennett saying, wait. You don't necessarily have to give up your free will. You just have to think about your definitions a little more carefully. Right. Okay. So I actually have two definitions, and I'm trying to summarize these as tightly as possible so that you can then use these as we go through the rest and hold them in your mind about what the differences are. So in a way, I'm trying to help us understand this difference a little more deeply.
Great. Do you want me to read the incompatibilist leaning definition? Okay. Free will is the ability to have genuinely chosen otherwise in the exact same circumstances. This requires a break from determinism so that true alternative possibilities can exist.
Right.
And then the compatibilist leaning definition, free will is the capacity to anticipate likely futures and take steps to enact desirable outcomes while evading undesirable ones. This embraces determinism as a requirement for agents to have evolved control, evitability, forecasting, and rational agency.
So there's potentially a lot packed into, both the interpretations and the definitions. But if we look at that incompatibilist leaning definition, I think this actually does a pretty good job of steel manning why you end up in incompatibilism, because there's a lot of notion of genuinely chosen otherwise in the exact same circumstances. Emphasis on the word exact same circumstances. So you'll get a lot of this could have done otherwise. And they'll say, well, in the exact same circumstance, with all my neurons lined up in exactly the same way, with all the chemicals firing, there's no way I could have chosen anything else, right? That's really because of their definition, that exact same circumstances makes them start to think in terms of metaphysical operations. Something has to break causality.
Right.
Whereas on the other side, we're saying, well, free will is not a break. It's something inside the compatibilist conscious free will decision-making process that doesn't require anything to be broken.
Yeah, so maybe if I can illustrate, maybe with an analogy, just to make sure I understand. So the incompatibilist in a situation like, let's just say someone cuts me off in traffic. They're going to say that unless I could have, in that same exact scenario, have chosen differently, that I do not have free will. Compatibilists might be willing to say, maybe in any particular circumstance where it's the exact same circumstance, you only had one choice as a result of materially what's going on. But when future instances of you being cut off in traffic happen, you do have the ability to pause, learn, reflect, maybe change where you'll be in very similar circumstances, but not the exact same, like metaphysical question circumstance. Am I understanding the difference between those that you're trying to illustrate on that slide correctly?
Yes, in partial, you're taking lessons from one and then applying it to a future date, which is part of a compatibilist view that you're learning from your experiences. The actual moment of choice, which is a little bit misleading anyway, because there is no actual moment of choice when we're talking about how brains operate. It's more an ongoing process. But the incompatibilists will say, whenever that choice was made, because of the configuration of everything, you would choose exactly the same thing. A compatibilist would say, you are correct. I agree. You would also choose exactly the same thing, giving the exact same set of circumstances and everything else. But the compatibilist would say, but there are so many variables and stuff in this that even a few seconds of reflection or thought might have had you choose something different, or if you had a little bit of different information, or if, all these other things that could have caused you to change. And those deltas, those changes, are where compatibilist free will comes in. The degrees of freedom, to what degree you can influence your choices, even though you are a product of all the things that have come down the pipe. So it's a forward-looking thing. It's basically saying, I have a capacity to look forward into the future and make choices about, or to predict what the outcomes of my choices might be, and then to select, very rapidly, depending upon what's going on, which one of those I want to embrace or have happen. Those hypothetical realities, those things that you look into the future, they don't actually exist, right? But from a incompatibilist viewpoint, they want those futures to actually exist in some sort of metaphysical MCU. The thing starts breaking off into other multiverses, right? Because they the only way for the choice to be real is you have to have a universe that follows determinism this way, and then it breaks and it follows determinism this way, and now I've got Spider-Man coming in, and you start the MCU problem of everything just starts to cascade into all these different multiverses. A compatibilist is saying, we don't need to worry about that. That's overthinking the issue, and just coming back and saying, what we really need to do is, what was your capacity to predict what the future might be based on your choices, and we can proportionately have a degree of free will which matches. So it's really a difference of degree and absolutism there too.
Yeah, and it on your previous slide, you had that it lines up with ethical questions, scientific questions, and lived experience. And I think that's one of the advantages I see to the compatibilist view, in the sense that a minute ago you were talking about the moment of choice, and that determining the moment of choice actually is one of the things I think that's very interesting about this question. And I think when I learned about the moment of choice, or the science behind moment of choice, it helped me see why I didn't share the incompatibilist view, because we are actually making choices like at a deeper level. The choices are being made before we think that our consciousness has made the choice. It's already been made, I guess, is the way I would put it. That's what science basically shows. And I know we'll get there in a minute, but that then causes me to ask the question, how can we change those responses that basically happen as the result of our material processes? Because I believe we can. I believe that matches my lived experience, that we can change those things through learning, through reflection, through how we choose to show up in the world. So while it might not look like the libertarian free will, or even what the incompatibilist view would require for free will, it's like, if we understand a little bit better of what's going on in all of these questions, that's, I guess, how I've been able to reconcile with the compatibilist views. That I think is actually, and I know I'm kind of getting ahead of where you're going to go in the slides, but to me, it is welded very clearly to this idea of, when do we actually make the choice? When does the choice actually get made? And I think that goes very well with the compatibilist view in my experience.
Yeah. Well, yes, I suppose we'll get to that as we talk through Sapolsky and Harris's kind of criticisms of free will as it is kind of felt, or whatever. Yeah.
Great. Let's do it.
All right. So we're going to start by steel manning a little bit the incompatibilist view first, so that we have a good understanding of that. And then from that, we'll then move into the compatibilist view and show where I think why compatibilism is superior, basically. So, all right. So this is from Sam Harris's very thin book, Free Will. And I actually recommend that if you're interested in free will, pick it up. It's short. It's a fast read, and it will give you the incompatibilist view in 2 hours, right? You'll understand it pretty well. But anyway, so here's Sam Harris's summary. I'll just read his thing right here. He says,
Great.
Our wills are simply not of our own making. Thoughts and intentions emerge from background causes of which we are unaware and over which we exert no conscious control. We do not have the freedom we think we have. And he's essentially correct. In fact, this is very much in line with what you just said, that a lot of your decision making is being done at a subconscious level, and then by the time it's raised to your full consciousness and you're able to report on it to other people, the decision's already largely been made, right? And so Sam is kind of taking this as saying the fact that you don't have a single point of decision that you can point to, it's actually hidden in your subconscious. That's bad for the notions of free will as we constantly, or as we traditionally think of it.
And I think that's where it does, like you just said, I think it does become about these absolutes, right? Because if you look at his first sentence, our wills are simply not of our own making. That's something I think that, and you can speak for yourself, but that's something as a compatibilist that I think I would agree with. But I think what Sam means when he says our wills are simply not of our own making is that for him, our wills need to be entirely of our own making for free will to exist. And that is something that I do not share. So it's like it's how far you take this argument, how absolute it must be for free will to exist. I think that kind of represents the divergent choice of, is someone going to be an incompatibilist or are they going to be a compatibilist? Would you agree with that? Or am I just speaking for myself?
No, I think you're very much catching the drift here. The primary difference is this absolute notion of it's all or nothing. It's like a light switch, on or off. You have free will or you don't, versus compatibilist view where it's like, no, it's a difference of degree. We're suggesting to you that you've kind of got lost in the weeds when you're thinking about a light switch. Instead, if you look at your experience and you know that you have the capacity to make better choices under certain circumstances with different things. And so that level of free will, we make proportionate to the level of praise or responsibility or blame. And that's what the court cases are all about and everything else, is we do have this understanding of a capacity to know what you did or the consequences of your action, and capacity to look forward. Those things are the main components of free will, not the ability to break determinism, right?
Right. And I think one of the things that I do take out of the incompatibilist view, this view that we do not have free will, that I think is a very important lesson that people need to learn, is when you move to, like, if you decide to move to compatibilism from incompatibilism, because I think that's a lot of people when they leave religions, like, first response is like, okay, because there's no ghost in the machine, I don't have free will. I think the lesson to take from the incompatibilist views is that free will is much more complicated than we ever thought it was. And that should give us compassion for people who, harm us in some way, who are interfacing with the criminal justice system. I guess what I'm saying is, even if I don't share a worldview like incompatibilism, I feel like I have learned a lot of lessons from listening to them talk and the reasons that they hold the opinions they do, because it allows me to see, okay, what lesson should I take from this? And the lesson I feel like I have taken from incompatibilists is that we have a lot less free will than we would have thought, when we believed in mind-body dualism, for example, or we believed in libertarian free will. And that allows me to have more compassion for people who make choices that I may not agree with.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you've really done a good job there of laying out that the incompatibilist view, to me, really feels like a reaction to that libertarian. They want to make sure that we're not letting the ghost back in the machine here in any of our discussions, but by being so zealous to make sure that there's no way for determinism to go awry is the way that they look at it, that they end up just getting rid of the whole concept. It can't be there at all. That's what it feels like to me. It's become an absolutist position rather than well, wait a minute, what do we mean by free will? Why don't we spend some time discussing that? Yeah.
To your point of it's an absolutist position, even look at his last sentence in this quote. We do not have the freedom we think we have. Well, I agree with that. Does that mean that we have no freedom at all? I think that is then the question. Exactly.
You're getting it. Yes. That compatibilism is not that you have all or nothing. It's you have some, and the sum that you have is sufficient. Yeah.
Great. Should we move on to Harris's clip here?
Yeah. This is a clip that you wanted to include that I think is really good for the consciousness element of free will, right? Yeah. This is a good one.
Perfect.
Let's run a little experiment. Think of a film, any film, it doesn't matter, a good one, a bad one. And notice what your conscious process of selection is like. Notice first that this is as free a decision as you're ever going to get. I mean, you have all the films in the world to choose from, and I've simply said, pick one. Does everybody have a film? I'm sorry to say you've all picked the wrong film. So don't ask me how I know that, but I do. Do it again. Pick another film and just be sensitive to what the experience is like. Do you see any evidence for free will there?
This weird kind of intuition.
Let's look for it. First, if it's not here, it's not anywhere. So we better be able to find it here. First, let's rule out all of those films whose names you don't know and which you haven't seen and which you couldn't have possibly thought of if your life depended on it. Okay, there's no freedom in that, obviously. But then there are all these other films which you're perfectly aware of, but which simply didn't come to consciousness. You absolutely know that The Wizard of Oz is a film, but you just didn't think of The Wizard of Oz. Now think about this. Were you free to choose that which did not occur to you to choose? For whatever reason, your Wizard of Oz circuits were not primed in such a way as to deliver it as a possibility. Of course, if you did think of The Wizard of Oz, you should consider yourself a genius. Okay, so you probably thought of several films. And let's say you thought of Lawrence of Arabia and Avatar and Mad Max. Okay, so you kind of converged on those three, and then you thought, well, I'm Australian, I'll go with Mad Max. And then you thought, no, Mel Gibson is more than a little creepy at this point in his life. So I'm going to go with Avatar. Okay? And you settled on Avatar. Well, you still don't know why you chose Avatar over Lawrence of Arabia. Okay, and this is the sort of decision that motivates the idea of free will. You go back and forth between two options, and you're not suffering any obvious constraints from the external world or any coercion. It just, you appear to be doing all of it. It's just you and your thoughts. But when you look closely, it is a mystery why you chose one over the other. And you might have a story to tell about it. You might say, well, I saw an animated movie last week, and Avatar's animated, so I remembered that, and so I just went with Avatar. Okay, well, the first thing to say is that we know that those sorts of explanations are almost always wrong. When you bring people into the lab and manipulate their decisions, they always have a story about why they did what they did, and it never bears any relationship to what actually influenced them. So you can bring people into the lab and give them a hot beverage as opposed to a cold one to hold in their hands and get them to cooperate more or to like one person more than another, and they have no idea that the temperature of the cup in their hands is influencing them at all. The psychology.
Okay. Yeah, I did want to include that clip because I think it in real time allows Sam to basically kind of present the way he sees these things. And I think it's a useful thought experiment. I've heard him do the same one with cities, like think of any city. You know, obviously you can't think of the cities that you don't know anything about or that you've never heard about. So I think it's important when we're responding, and you've done a great job of steel manning his position already, but I think this allows people to kind of see an insight into the way Sam thinks about this and the way that people who have that incompatibilist view think about that. There were a few very interesting little tidbits he said in there, and you can see the absolutism we were just talking about and the way he talks about it, where he says, like, when we get people in a lab, like he is, and it's completely understandable because he is a neuroscientist, right, by profession and by training. And so he's automatically thinking, like, unless I can find the conscious, like whatever, the particle that results in that choice, it must not exist. That's the way he's thinking about it.
It's like we're hunting for free will juice or something, right?
Exactly.
We're going to find it. And you know, the Bender thing that we did at the very beginning, it's the same idea. I can't find free will, so I'm going to hunt for it. I'm going to go out and try and find, I can't find it, must not exist. But it might be that your definitions, and this is the part that every time I see Sam Harris do this, he always does this like, well, these things didn't occur to you, so it's not a free choice. I'm like, wait. Hold on. Maybe it is kind of a free choice between the ones that did occur to me. You know, like like he's like doing this all or nothing. You had to know all of the entire roster of films in order for it to be a truly free choice. And the compatibilists say, no, it's okay. Maybe you only pick between one of these three, and maybe your reasons weren't even presented to yourself, but that's still the locus of responsibility. The guy who made the choice, that's you. And you don't need that absolutist notion of I had the ability to do anything. I was actually constrained greatly by my thoughts and my position and everything else. But within those constraints, there's a degree, and I'm allowed to be responsible to that same degree.
Right. I also think the incompatibilist view kind of ignores like successive events, right? So let's say in his hypothetical, we're asked about a movie, we try and think about a movie, and maybe everything he said in that clip is absolutely true, right? We can't think of the movies that we've never heard of. For some reason, we're going to land on a movie, we don't fully understand it. I completely agree with that. Like when people ask you what your favorite color is, you can't really, there's sometimes I think that people get so bogged down in asking the question why, that sometimes why is like almost an unintelligible question. Like, why do you prefer blue over purple? I don't know. I just do. That's just the way that I feel. I have a stronger affinity for purple. So I might think of The Wizard of Oz as opposed to other movies that I might have thought of just because it's my favorite movie or maybe I watched it. But I think the thing he ignores is if we know we're going to be asked that same question in a week, we could spend time studying movie history. We could spend time watching more movies, and we can change the inputs of the next time we're caused to make that decision. And I think that because they're looking for libertarian free will and they don't see libertarian free will, they believe there can't be any free will. when really we just have to kind of change the way we think about what free will means. But my lived experience is that we do have it for the exact reason I just gave you. I've thought about this example when he's used it with cities before. And I don't know, do you have any thoughts about that? I feel like that really helps, using his contemporary example, explain how a compatibilist would look at that.
Yeah, I think you did a really good job, especially like, for example, he uses this, pick a city, and then he says, well, this city didn't occur to you, right? Well, suppose he said, pick a city, but then he handed everybody an almanac of cities. You'd have this broader thing. Now, my question to Sam is that a little bit freer of a choice? And if his answer is yes, I'm like, welcome to compatibilism, right? Like as soon as you open up and expand your opportunities, then you are, and there's nothing else to call it, you are expanding your freedom, right? I don't know what else you call it when you take somebody from handcuffs to out of handcuffs, from being able to only look at this to being able to do the wider range. That is freedom, that this broadening out. And so free will is the capacity to choose or do more things, not necessarily that instant action of very limited sort of absolute. Anyway, sorry, I want to steel man incompatibilism, but I can feel my but here are some of the problems creeping up. So
that's okay.
We should probably stay there. Yeah.
I'm jumping off on trying to respond too early also. So let's talk about Sapolsky and Sapolsky's view on steel manning again, incompatibilism. Do you want me to read this quote from him?
Yeah, but just a quick little note on Sapolsky that I didn't include here. So he talks in this book, Determinism, or Determined, that he had kind of a almost spiritual experience at the age of 14 where he realized that there was no free will in the universe, and that he's been continuing from that position ever since. And it's interesting that he acknowledges that there was almost a conversion, that he went through an emotional reaction. He also refers to himself in his book Determined as a flaming hypocrite on the question of free will, because he himself acts as though there's free will, judges people as though there's free will, but then he says, but there can't be because of these reasons, right? And so he's trying to force his worldview to fit with his premises of this metaphysical notion of free will, I think. And it's hard for him. I actually feel bad for him when I listen to him speak, because he gets into these little corners of but so I don't know what to do. And I'll be, it's your premises. Check your premises. You might want to rethink some stuff. Anyway, with that background, let's go ahead and
Perfect. And you said he had that kind of spiritual experience when he was a few months shy of his 14th birthday. Is that what you said?
14th birthday, I think. Yeah, I think he was 14. Yeah.
Okay. You cannot decide all the sensory stimuli in your environment. Your hormone levels this morning, whether something traumatic happened to you in the past, the socioeconomic status of your parents, your fetal environment, your genes, whether your ancestors were farmers or herders. Let me state this most broadly. Probably at this point, too broadly for most readers. We are nothing more or less than the cumulative biological and environmental luck over which we had no control that brought us to any moment.
That's a really good way of how he's sealing it all up. It's now sealed up nice and tight. You're just a product of all of the factors and features that went before, your genes, everything. The thing is he's right. All of these things absolutely do influence you and absolutely do shape who you are. But the notion that it's non-zero, that you have no opportunity as an agent to make actual synthesis of all these things that focused and then make a choice for you personally, that seems like a bridge too far to me. I'm actually in the camp of, well, the reason all this stuff came together and that your consciousness to begin with is so that you can make decisions and predictions about the future. Otherwise, it wouldn't even be held in your consciousness at all. That there's a reason for you to feel this sense of being able to make decisions. Otherwise, you wouldn't have evolved that capacity to feel that way.
Right. No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think at a very fundamental level, we also see this even in animals that we don't think of necessarily as having, and I guess that actually is an interesting way to think about compatibilism, right? Is because you start to think about free will more as a spectrum. And and I would say you can see consciousness the same way. And I think we see that even when we engage with animals. My wife and I, about 2 years ago, got our first puppy for the kids. And he's a half beagle, half golden doodle named Darwin, because Darwin's ship was the HMS Beagle, right? And I'm never tire of it, never tire of explaining that joke. But Darwin can recognize signals in his environment, like the word park, like the word walk. And that's not to say that he like has free will, but I guess when you start thinking about like gradation, when you open yourself up to thinking about these things more as a spectrum of choice rather than thinking about it in terms of absolutes, I think my experience with animals and seeing the way that they develop, or children, the way that they start to develop, their ability to make choices on a spectrum, and that spectrum, different kids are going to fall on different spectrums at different times. And I guess thinking about it that way has been really helpful for me to looking at these questions. I think you have one more quote from Sam, or a couple more quotes from Sam.
Yeah, a couple more kind of driving home Sam's points here on incompatibilism. But at the same time, I think it's really good to have a good understanding of where these guys are coming from.
Of course. Yeah. Do you want me to read this first quote?
Sure.
The men and women on death row have some combination of bad genes, bad parents, bad environments, and bad ideas. And the innocent, of course, have supremely bad luck. Which of these quantities exactly were they responsible for? No human being is responsible for his genes or his upbringing, yet we have every reason to believe that these factors determine his character. Our system of justice should reflect an understanding that any of us who have been dealt a very different hand, or any of us could have been dealt a very different hand in life. In fact, it seems immoral not to recognize just how luck is involved in morality itself. Man, I have so many thoughts about that quote, because like most of the things I read from Sam, I agree with a lot of it. And then it's just like there are a few parts of it I don't agree with. I think in particular, the one that stands out to me here is him talking about bad ideas and then saying that, like, which of these exactly is this person responsible for? I don't know that I would agree with him that people aren't. Again, I'm not saying people are fully responsible for their bad ideas, but I don't know I would agree with Sam that people are fully, that they lack all culpability for some of the ideas that they have. Like who we choose to associate with, what information we choose to take in, I think affects the ideas that come out of us, and the ideas that we have affect the way we show up in the world. And so I guess it's just the question of, I guess Sam doesn't believe in those moments of like pause and repose where you can choose to change your inputs, I guess would be the way, right? He views those inputs as always coming as a consequence of, again, going back to his quote, going back to our genes, our parents, our environments. So he's going to see everything as just a circle. So any choice we make is just a result of the bad environments, bad parents, bad genes, and bad ideas.
One of the words that comes up a lot is the word responsible, which is used here. No human being is responsible for his genes or upbringing. Well, the etymology of the word responsible is literally response able. I'm able to respond and explain. That's why who's responsible for this? We're asking the question of who can respond and give me the reasons or the explanation for why this choice was made. So this idea of not being responsible also pushes it kind of metaphysical, where he's like, well, you're not responsible for it, but actually you are. You're the one who could respond to explain your reasons. Nobody else can. So responsibility does lie with the agent who is making these choices. And when they say you're not responsible for that, I'm like, well, I think that's the whole reason you exist as an agent, is to have respond ability or responsibility.
Right. And I love that. That's one of the reasons I guess my mind went to my experiences with my dog, is I see the ability to respond even in an animal that a lot of times people might not think has the same ability that humans do. And I would agree with that. That's where that it gets in my mind on this question of a spectrum, right?
Yes.
Do you want me to read this second one and then we can get your thoughts on it? Great.
Yeah.
My choices matter, and there are paths toward making wiser ones, but I cannot choose what I choose. And if it ever happens, and if it ever appears that I do, for instance, after going back between two options, I do not choose to choose what I choose. There is a regress here that always ends in darkness.
So this is fascinating. I've been a little side note here. I've been using Sam Harris's meditation app now for many years. I was at his launch of the Waking Up book and the app. And so I've listened to a lot of Sam Harris on meditation. And I think his views on free will have been heavily shaped by his views on meditation, because a big part of meditation is that you start to recognize how little control you have over your own thoughts, how they're always kind of bouncing around. And the whole point of meditation is kind of this focus on trying to gain a little more control to train your brain, which is kind of interesting that Sam on the one hand says you don't have free will, but you should learn all about how your brain works so you can shape it and train it and get better. He holds both these things kind of simultaneously about you should meditate to train your brain, but you don't have free will. So what are you doing, I guess, Sam, if you're not trying to get more opportunity? But anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is that because of his experience with meditation, he has a lot of experience with sitting there and feeling those thoughts bubble up, feeling those things, working through it. So I believe that he has worked that into the experience of free will, that in the same way that as you're sitting there meditating, that when you're making choices, everything's happening subconsciously and you're just becoming aware of it at the end of the tail end rather than actually being engaged with it. And so to me, I think Sam's involvement with meditation has disinclined him towards accepting free will. And there is some truth to that in terms of, like Vipassana forms of meditation where you start to think, well, I don't really have control over things. I'm just kind of an observer of my own actions. So anyway, I think that's worth knowing, that I think his meditative practices influence him in this view.
It is kind of an odd tension, though, like taking the time and devoting oneself to those meditation practices is kind of difficult for me to understand in a world where you don't believe in free will. Like,
right. Yeah.
But I guess he just would believe that he has this natural inclination towards those, like trying to find those moments of pause and repose and gaining more control over his nervous system. And so he just like leans into those, or I guess I don't know, trying to make sense of like why you would choose to dedicate so much time to something that a lot of people have no interest in is just kind of an interesting thing to me when you don't believe in free will. Maybe it's a little bit like, I guess I've never heard Sam speak to this question directly. Maybe it's a little bit like Sapolsky, where I think most people who even believe that we don't have free will continue to act like we do have free will and like their choices matter, because it's just such a unpalatable view from a productivity standpoint, from a happiness standpoint, to feel like your choices do not actually matter. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think you're exactly correct on pretty much all of those things as it relates to how Sam tends to there's a cognitive dissonance there that you picked up on, that I picked up on there too, that I think should exist. That on the one hand, train your brain, do meditation, get better. Oh, and on the other hand, you don't have free will and you can't do that anyway. It's kind of, what are you saying exactly here, Sam, about how much control do you have over your brain? It's just, to me, I don't understand exactly where he's coming from, I guess.
Yeah, it just seems like there's an a deep inconsistency in like choosing to dedicate yourself to something like that when you believe that your choices are just the product of the brain's like natural materialistic consequences, and that you don't have a compatibilist view of free will. I guess that's right. I don't know. I'll never probably get the chance to ask Sam that question, but I'd like to understand that. So that I can make sure that I'm not straw manning his position. Like, I'd like to understand how he looks at those things. I think the one last thing I'll say, and then we'll go to the last quotes by Sapolsky, is that view of like, even though I do believe in hard determinism and I do not believe in a compatibilist view of free will, I'm going to choose to act like I do, is actually the camp I landed in for a few years before I learned about compatibilism and listened to some of these people. The way I would phrase it often after I'd listened to Sam's lectures on this and read his book was, I just don't think it's worthwhile for us to engage in determining whether we actually have free will, because it can lead to such scary implications for the way certain people make decisions. And so, I guess for what it's worth, there was a time when I thought, this is, even if it's true, this is not something that I should necessarily spend a lot of time on or even like talk about, because there are certain people in the population that I think if they are really told that their choices don't matter, will kind of follow that through in a way that can get probably pretty scary for other people in their orbit. So there are some reasons, I guess, to take Sapolsky's view that like, even if I believe in this hard determinism and incompatibilism, that I am going to act like I don't for the social benefits, I guess, for the utility.
Yes. Yep. They end up being pragmatic and compatibilist in the end anyway, right?
Right.
They start acting like compatibilists. Yeah.
Right. So you've got a few quotes from Sapolsky here. I'll go ahead and read the first one, and you tell me what we want to say about this one. This book has a goal to get people to think differently about moral responsibility, blame and praise, and the notion of our being free agents, and to feel differently about those issues as well. And most of all, to change fundamental aspects of how we behave.
It's that last sentence that I think is interesting. He says, and most of all, to change fundamental aspects of how we behave. What's funny is then as you read on and read more Sapolsky, he doesn't really have solutions. He has more of these general principles. So I'm not sure how he wants us to change the behaviors. In other words, the whole point of his book, at the end, he ends up, in my opinion, backing off of it. Like he's like, well, I'm not sure how to do any of this. I just think we need to somehow change.
How would one believe that a book they're writing can invite people to change fundamental aspects of how they behave when they don't believe in a compatibilist view of free will?
I don't really know. It seems to me like they're trying to say we need to accept the reality of what it really is and then try and adjust our legal and moral systems to fit with this reality that we're proposing. And our legal and moral systems don't currently fit that. But we're not sure how we need to change it. You know, that to me, I'm not quite exactly sure what they want people to do, other than they keep saying, both Sapolsky and Harris, we should probably give up on our notions of free will. And then you say, okay, now what? And they're like, I don't know. It's kind of a mess now. But we should maybe, and you hit on, we should maybe be kinder and that sort of, that's true. That's good. But what do we do in the legal court system? What are we going to do? And they don't have answers. And I think that's worth noting, you know.
Well, and yes, that definitely is worth noting. But I think I'm also talking just about like the fundamental idea of trying to change people's minds when you feel like people are just the result of like the inputs in the system. I guess you can acknowledge that, well, now I'm an input in the system, or now my book is an input in the system. But it would seem to me that if you take this incompatibilist view, people are either going to believe that idea or they're not going to believe that idea. I don't know that you can. I guess I just am noticing again, kind of like almost like an inconsistency with the idea that you can change fundamental aspects of people's behavior when you don't believe in free will. That just seems like kind of it almost seems like an oxymoron, right? Like, I'm going to teach you that you don't have free will so that it changes the way you behave. Well, that's like kind of a weird thing to say. I don't know.
I agree. It feels like that would create some cognitive dissonance. In fact, that's kind of what it did for me too after a while. And you too, apparently. You start thinking about it, and at first you're like, oh, there's no free will. Oh, well, then maybe I'll act like there's free will, but there's still none. And then you go, well, maybe my definition of free will is problematic. Maybe I'm thinking about free will a little bit wrong. And once you start thinking about it in a different way, and in my opinion, you kind of graduate. You go through those steps, and then you go, oh, well, actually, free will isn't that metaphysical thing. It's maybe something else. And we're fine with that. We can actually work with definitions of free will that are utilitarian and workable. Yeah.
Right. And the interesting thing about moving to that, like the way you phrased it, I totally agree with, is it allows you to take, I think, some really serious advantages out of that incompatibilist worldview, which is we should treat people like that their origins and their inputs heavily impact and can oftentimes be conclusive of the decision they're going to make. And so maybe we need to rethink how culpable people are, but it doesn't mean that people are not completely inculpable when we're talking about these questions.
Yep, it's very much that proportionate thing, you know, like Hume says, proportion my belief to the evidence. This is kind of a similar thing. Proportion free will to the capacity for forethought and for action at the time of decision. And if you start thinking like that, then you'll start to go, oh, I can actually measure free will. I can see free will. I can use it, rather than talk about it as a metaphysical substance that nobody can find. Yeah.
Right.
All right.
Do you want to hit the rest of these quotes?
Sure. So then here's Sapolsky, and this is actually him talking about the Cartesian theater indirectly. He's saying, you know, if free will exists, show me a neuron that just caused a behavior to occur in the complete absence of any influences coming from other neurons. Notice that, complete absence of any influences coming from other neurons, from the neuron's energy state, from hormones, from any environmental event stretching back through fetal life, from genes. So he's like, in order for free will to exist, he believes you have to have a deciding neuron that caused a behavior that had no influences on it. And that's kind of a very strange definition to arrive at, like, again, metaphysical. It has to break away. And because you can't show that, he says there's no free will. But maybe your definition is just wrong, Sapolsky.
Right. It very much does, and I know you talked about this, but it very much does show the relationship between libertarian free will and this incompatibilist view that goes along with materialism. They're both incompatibilists because it's almost like Sapolsky and Harris and people who share their opinion are looking for libertarian free will, find that it doesn't exist, and then say, therefore, no free will exists. That's very much what it looks like to me, especially when you look at that quote, right? Show me a neuron that caused a behavior in the complete absence of any influences coming from other neurons. Well, who's to say that that's what's required for free will?
Exactly. How does that help you?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'll read this last one. I can't really imagine how to live your life as if there is no free will. It may never be possible to view ourselves as the sum of our biology. Perhaps we'll have to settle for making sure our homuncular myths are benign and save the heavy lifting of truly thinking rationally for where it matters, where we judge others harshly.
Yeah, so even Sapolsky is, I don't know if we can ever free ourselves from this position, but he's still advocating for it. He's still like, but I think we should, which is,
and specifically, he's saying that we should, and we should in particular think about it when we want to treat other people harshly. So that's the interesting thing to me is like, I agree with that. I think it has given me a lot, learning from incompatibilists has given me a lot more ability to have compassion for people that I have disputes with. I can see people largely as the product of their environment and their inputs, but it doesn't, I still think that people are responsible for their decisions, where I think the incompatibilists do not see it that way.
Right. Okay, so our next slide, this is actually really good because they're pushing for, we should recognize that there's no free will, but there's been studies. What happens when people no longer believe in free will? If they were taught, what happens to those people? And they've discovered through some tests that once you start telling people they don't have free will, it corrupts what the decisions they make. They start to feel, I'm not really responsible. I can get away with stuff if it's not me. And so we don't actually, maybe it's worth reading this abstract, but there are other papers that have done this, where basically the test is they come in, they give different groups little lectures on free will versus compatible free will and different things. And then they have them take various tests. And sometimes it's like, eating M&Ms or whatever. And they just measure how much they change before and after having these experiences or these lectures. And then from that, they're able to extract some data about whether or not free will is actually changing people's capacity for choice making. Anyway,
I think this right here, I think this study is actually the reason that I had kind of landed where I was as an incompatibilist. Is I don't think this is something useful to put out into the world because the effects on society are not good effects.
Yeah,
that's
go ahead.
That is not true. That would just be an argument from consequences. But I do think there's some utility to arguments from consequences, types of arguments that are important to talk about. And so I did just view it as a utility thing. Let me read this abstract because I do think it's interesting to share with people. Regardless of whether free will exists, believing that it does affects one's behavior. When an individual's belief in free will is challenged, one can become more likely to act in an uncooperative manner. The mechanism behind the relationship between one's belief in free will and behavior is still debated. The current study uses an economic contribution game under varying time constraints to elucidate whether reducing belief in free will allows one to justify negative behavior or if the effect occurs at a more intuitive level of processing. Here we show that although people are intuitively cooperative, challenging their belief in free will corrupts this behavior, leading to impulsive selfishness. If given time to think, however, people are able to override the initial inclination towards self-interest induced by encouraging a belief in free will. And I understand that incompatibilists won't see it this way, but that study actually is a pretty good indication to me of why we believe in compatibilist free will. Because if your beliefs that you can change by what you put into your system can help change your actions, it is a very good signal to me that compatibilist free will exists, at least in some degree, because if belief in free will itself can change people's behavior, at the extent to that it can be studied, I think it's a good signal of why compatibilist free will is a very good thing to talk about, and that it's almost evidence that it exists.
Yes, I totally agree that you're like, well, let's talk about free will. Oh, just talking about free will causes people to change their behaviors a little bit. Maybe there's something to it. maybe
100%.
Maybe there's something to this. Reasons that you present to yourself actually does influence your behavior. So free will maybe actually might exist, just not what we think. All right. So Sapolsky knows this, right? Sapolsky knows that there have been tests. So this is the Sapolsky's lament. This is probably the last word we have on incompatibilism. And in a way, I also think it's a good wrap up for the problem that they face.
Great. You want me to read the first one?
Sure.
Thus undermine someone's belief in free will, and they feel less of a sense of agency, meaning, or self-knowledge, less gratitude for other people's kindness, and more importantly, for our purposes, they become less ethical in their behavior, less helpful, and more aggressive.
Ugh. So why would you want to undermine someone's belief in free will if we know this from testing?
Yeah.
But he knows it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll read his final part. Here he says, so we're at loggerheads. There is no such thing as free will, and blame and punishment are without any ethical justification. But we've evolved to find the right kind of punishment viscerally rewarding. This is hopeless. So that's his position on, crime and punishment, that it's just something that we've evolved to like, but it's no ethical justification in his view. No such thing as free will. Pretty hard line there. Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to wrap this up. You remember that definition I went back to way about the could have done otherwise? I believe this is the trap that they fell into when you get into incompatibilism, that you start thinking, well, free will requires these multiple genuine outcomes. However, in order to test that, the only way you could ever test to see if you really have these other things, you'd have to be able to travel back in time and relive that, right? There's no other way that I can think of a way to test the could have done otherwise hypothesis. That, if you're in this hypothesis of I'm exact same situation, I can do two different things. Well, how could you test that? Well, somehow you're going to have to rewind the tape to have the exact same situation to see if anything will come out. Because you can't test that, it becomes purely hypothetical. It's a time travel sort of way of thinking. It's metaphysical. That's what I'm trying to say. There's no way to even know if this notion of free will is genuine because there's no way to test for it. Right.
Right.
That's why this multiple universes, timelines, magical thinking starts to accommodate this unprovable intuition. Could have done otherwise under the exact same circumstances. Is the only way I can have free will. There's no way to prove that. You cannot prove the could have done otherwise hypothesis under exact same circumstances. So it's kind of to me, it's a dead end. It makes you think in metaphysical terms, and we shouldn't be thinking about the could have done otherwise trap of exact same circumstances. Could I have broken the universe? Yeah.
Right.
So now, at last, compatibilism. We can lay these out, although we've been talking about all the way along, and this will probably reinforce some of the things we've talked about. Make sense of stuff, right? Okay. All right, so let's talk. I actually find that the definitions of compatibilism on Wikipedia aren't too bad. These first two paragraphs kind of give you the broad stroke. So please go ahead and read some of that, maybe.
Yeah, of course. Compatibilism is the belief that free will and determinism are mutually compatible, and that it is possible to believe in both without being logically inconsistent. As Steven Weinberg puts it, I would say that free will is nothing but our conscious experience of deciding what to do, which I know I am experiencing as I write this review, and this experience is not invalidated by the reflection that physical laws made it inevitable that I would want to make those decisions. The opposing belief that the thesis of determinism is logically incompatible with the classical thesis of free will is known as incompatibilism. Compatibilists believe that freedom can be present or absent in situations for reasons that have nothing to do with metaphysics. In other words, that causal determinism does not exclude the truth of possible future outcomes. Because free will is seen as a necessary prerequisite for moral responsibility, compatibilism is often used to support compatibility between moral responsibility and determinism.
All right, good. Yes, I think that's actually pretty good layout. So now we're back to Dan Dennett, and he actually laid out some definitions that I think if you use these definitions, they're a little different than that could have done otherwise, but they're more accurate to our experiences. This first one is the idea that we've been talking about, but free will is an ability to see probable futures that seem like they're going to happen in time to take steps that something else happens instead. And he calls this evitability, that you can see, oh, if I go there, that's going to be bad, so I'm going to evade that. And so free will, at least in part, is the ability to evade bad outcomes that might happen in the future. So when you turn your steering wheel on the car to avoid that accident, there you're engaging with a bit of free will.
Yeah, the thing I really like about this one, aside from the fact that I might change it to probable futures to possible futures because of my love for Frank Herbert's Dune franchise, but I really like the way he phrases that. The ability to think about probable futures that seem like they're going to happen, and in time take steps so that something else happens instead. I think, when we talk about the lived experiences, earlier you talked about ethics, science, and lived experience. To me, that very much tracks with my lived experience of having, like, I've even had it when I've had, like, let's say I was looking at 2 different job opportunities. I can look at the branching paths that can create. And instead of thinking like literally about, MCU timeline stuff, you can think about it purely as like a theoretical, hypothetical idea of, if I choose this path, these are the likely follow-on consequences. If I choose this path, these are the likely follow-on consequences. And that doesn't mean that moment of choice, like when you actually make the decision, is what we would typically think of like, oh, I signed the offer letter for job A and I sent an email to job B saying I wasn't going to take that choice. It actually usually happens earlier than that. I think that's one of the other things I learned from compatibilism, and these discussions between the incompatibilists and compatibilists, is when you start thinking about the moment of choice actually happens much earlier than you think, often in the way you've changed your inputs, and then the decision kind of like naturally follows on as a consequence of that. I think it can really, I don't know, that line, the way that Dennett puts it, just really resonates with me, because that is, I think, where we find free will, is in creating those moments and creating those spaces of reflection to look at those possible futures and then to try and decide, like, well, which of these possible futures would I rather live in, and deal with the consequences, both good and bad, of any one of them.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's the more kind of inputs, the more opportunities you have into your decision-making process, the greater sort of freedom that you can squeeze out of things. So yeah, a lot of times your decision-making process is really a change in your inputs at some level. You just don't really recognize it until you say, oh, I guess I've made a decision. And the reason I made that is because I learned this thing or whatever. Right? Your input changed. Yeah,
exactly.
Let's see. I'll read his next one here. This is also another definition where he says, the ability of rational agents to act out of self-determination, to select actions from a broad set of possible alternatives based on rational expectations of their consequences. Again, so not a could have done otherwise, right? We're not talking about going backward in the past. He's talking about ability, capacity, things in the future. That's what he's talking about. To act out of self-determination, to select actions. So there's like a backward-facing thing that incompatibilists get hung up on, whereas I think compatibilists are usually like, what can you do? What's in the future? What are your capacities? Rather than that backwards, oh, you were locked in.
Right. And I think the thing I like about the second definition too, and the reason I'm glad we played that Sam Harris clip, is I think it really illustrates the difference between their views, right? And what you said at the beginning of our presentation, it turns on these definitions of what free will is. But you can see that Dennett says that free will can exist when you are able to select from a broad set of possible alternatives. And in using the movie example that Sam used, in his view, you only have free will if you're able to choose basically from all of the options.
Yeah. Yeah. A very absolute way of doing it. So then I just kind of summarized here that from reading Dennett, really the two kind of pistons that he turns on is self-control. You have control of your own body and the choices that you're going to make to a certain degree, and the ability to forecast the consequences of your action. If you have those two things, and they're actually measurable things, you can start to look at these. You can say, that's probably evidence of free will. Because you'll know if somebody's like the difference in inebriation. If somebody's drunk or not drunk, they have more or less self-control, more or less free will. You start to see the graduation in how this stuff works.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Differential incapacity. I really differential incapacity. If you keep that in mind, it's a change between different states rather than an absolute notion.
Right. And then the second bullet point is, we've talked about this spectrum, something you can have more or less of. I think that's a very good way of thinking about it. It doesn't have to be, like you said, the light switch is either on or the light switch is either off. That free will is a spectrum depending on, inebriation is a great example of that's something that can reduce our ability to have free will. Having a more serious addiction, like a drug addiction, is going to be something that's obviously going to drastically reduce your free will at a biological level, right? Because your biological needs for certain substances is going to take precedence over your ability to find those moments of pause and repose and to engage in that self-control and forecasting of consequences.
Yes. All right. Let's okay. So I have a clip here. This is from Dan Dennett's final interview, and he's actually not at his best health when he's doing this because it's only about 3 weeks before he died. He had just had some brain surgery and was recovering, and he went back out on the road to do a bunch of interviews and stuff, and a lot of the stuff were people asking about free will. So anyway, I have a 1-minute criticism here where basically he talks about Harris and Sapolsky, and I think he kind of summarizes a lot what we said, but it's just good to know that we're on the same page, I think, as Dan Dennett here.
Great.
Free will isn't what Sapolsky thinks it is. I'm just astonished at how both Sam Harris and Robert Sapolsky and some other scientists have been, I think, conned really into thinking that free will depends on indeterminism by some philosophers who have inflated free will beyond what it actually is. Free will isn't a metaphysical condition that you're blessed with or not. It's an achievement. And it's the achievement of mature self-control. You don't have it when you're a baby. You don't have it till you've reached adulthood, really. And so we don't hold you responsible for things until you're an adult, and we don't hold you responsible then if you don't have self-control. That's self-control is the key notion.
So there. I think he does a pretty good job, I think, of summarizing. It's not metaphysical; it's primarily about self-control. All right, so the next slides. I don't know if we want to keep rolling, but the next slides, I actually tried to give some examples of Dennett laying out some free will, both precursors and then so that you can see more clearly how this operates in the real world, right? So one of the things in his book, Freedom Evolves, which I think is a great book, as he talks about chess engines as kind of an example of a precursor of a type of free will, a type of evitability, even though we all know that, chess engines are completely determined all the way down at their level of, micro. It's about as good a case of a robot as you can imagine as a chess engine, right? All it does is play chess and plays chess endlessly. But Dennett says you can see a form of free will even in a chess engine. And so go ahead and read this quote from Freedom Evolves here.
He says, in a deterministic world, chess-playing computers exhibit a primitive form of evitability. They can avoid disastrous futures by computing ahead and choosing differently, even though every move is fully caused. This shows how degrees of freedom emerge from complexity, laying groundwork for the evolved free will worth wanting in humans, rational agents who represent reasons to themselves and act upon them.
Yeah, so in his description here of chess engines and how they work, I think it's really worthwhile knowing that the guys who program chess engines speak of their engine as being free to decide what move it's going to make, right? They're not determining it. They've programmed all this stuff into it. And then when a chess engine is engaged, what you will see, you can see off to the side, it'll see these lines that it's selecting between. So you'll see them and they'll be ranked and they'll be moving in different positions. So it's actually, and then it says it's free to choose any of those positions for as long as it's in that determined or that time-bound state. And you can see it kind of thinking. And the longer it goes, the better it gets, the better the outcome is. And so this is very much like kind of our own free will. The longer or the more you introduce, the more inputs you have into a system, the better the outcomes can be in the same way. So he's making this analogy that a chess computer has a very limited form of kind of free will when it's in its thinking state. that it's, you know, it's computing, it's figuring stuff out, kind of like we might be. He's not saying chess engines are free. He's saying this is a way to help you kind of intuition pump how there is freedom, even in things that we might think are not free at all. And a chess engine he's proposing actually on this little grid of 64 squares goes very deep into thinking and spending time and doing what we might think is kind of like free will. It's selecting between its options. Yeah.
Right. And this helps, again, kind of show the difference between free will and consciousness. No one is going to say that a chess engine has consciousness, but it does have this compatibilist version of free will, because even though it's programmed all the way down, it has that ability to pause and think through those possible futures. I think that's a great example.
Yeah, it's not full compatibilism like we would have, but it's more of something like this as a way to, you know, prime your brain.
Right.
Because I think Dennett would say, well, it's not really free will.
No, it's just an analogy. Yeah,
analogy.
No, I understand. Yeah. But the reason it's so useful is because we know for a fact that those things are programmed all the way down, that they are just a result of their inputs. And yet we can see this moment that it's able to pause and use it as an analogy to think through that. Yeah, I completely agree. All right.
So then here's some other examples of free will by degrees. And these are the sort of examples that I think are good to help you think about stuff. So again, one is that simply just if you're imprisoned or handcuffed versus being free, there's a degree of difference right there. And it's quite obvious. You get more freedom from more physical liberty. That's quite obvious. And this is Thomas Hobbes' quote, who kind of puts that. Go ahead and read that maybe.
A free man is he that in those things which by his strength and wit he is able to do, is not hindered to do what he has a will to do.
So basically the physical, if you can do it, that's within your sphere of free will, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is, again, more free will by degrees. I use the example of crossing a minefield, that if you were put in a position where you need to run across a minefield and you don't know where any of the mines are, right? And you just go running across, well, you have almost no free will in that matter because it's very random, right? There's no determinism. However, if you had a map of that thing, now suddenly you introduce an element of free will. You can now start making reasonable choices. So you get more freedom from having an input of more intelligence. You get it expands things out a little bit. And then Daniel Dennett uses a very similar metaphor here, which go ahead and read that one.
He says, in fact, if you are faced with the prospect of running across an open field in which lightning bolts are going to be a problem, you are much better off if their timing and location are determined by something, since then they may be predictable by you and hence avoidable. Determinism is the friend, not the foe, of those who dislike inevitability.
This is a big point of what Dennett wants to point out, is that we've evolved to be able to look forward, but we had to look forward into a mostly deterministic universe, a universe that is deterministic chaos, in order for us to develop this capacity to see things that might happen in the future. And so when you have regular predictable outcomes, that gives you the capacity to predict what's going to happen. If you live in a world where you didn't have regular predictable outcomes, you would not have free will, right? You wouldn't have that capacity to predict what's going to happen. You need that predictability.
Right. And you can see the connection between determinism and basically like this idea of fate. I think some of the worst, and it's a trope in fiction, right? Like Greek tragedies often had this theme of inevitability, that even it's almost like trying to choose. This is like the whole problem of Oedipus, right? Trying to get off the track of fulfilling a prophecy, ironically, then makes that prophecy happen because it was already determined. So you can kind of see the connection between these ideas.
All right, Dennett touched on this one too. Another one is coming to maturity. When you're young and a baby, you have almost no free will at all. But over time, gradually by small steps, you get more and more responsibility, get more and more self-control, more ability to predict what, if I do this, the outcomes will be. And so we've actually set up our society around the idea of, as you age, you get more freedoms to do more things, because we recognize, hopefully, your brain is changing and you're beginning to understand, if I do this, these are the consequences.
Right.
So, yep. All right. So now this is actually, I think, really good, especially because you're a lawyer. So we face free will every day in the courtroom, right? And whether or not it happens. And I think a really good example of that is murder by degree. That whenever somebody is murdered, one of the first things you do is how much free will did they have? Because that determines culpability. And this is where the rubber hits the road, right? This is where we actually have to define what is free will and what did they know when. And I think it's worth maybe, I would love, actually is probably a better way to do it. I would love your opinion on these different types of murder and whether or not you think this is, a good way to approach the question of free will in the courtroom by breaking things into degrees. Again, we're talking degrees of freedom. It lines up. Or if there's, something else or what you would do. Just what's your take on degrees of murder or degrees of crime?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think the current system we have right now makes a lot of sense because the way I think about this is, and I know that you've had a similar conversation a few years ago with Jonathan Streeter, and I really liked the way you talked about it. If your spouse is killed in a situation, it is going to feel a whole lot different if that person who did that engaged in first degree murder, which what we typically look for in the law. Every state law is slightly different, but they generally follow broad patterns, right? You're looking for premeditation and you're looking for like a moment of repose. That's the big separation between first and second degree murder, is like a moment of calm repose that allows someone to have that level of free will, to have that level of intentionality. It certainly feels a lot worse if someone were to do something untoward to your spouse or someone who's important to you with the intention of doing that and premeditated it. That feels so different than like, voluntary manslaughter or involuntary manslaughter, where it's the result of some negligence. So the big separation in law is negligence is not like affirmatively trying to cause any harm. It's not intentional. It's that you made a decision at some point along the track to not follow some standard, is the way I would put it. Negligence requires that you breach some duty that you owed somebody. And so I think from a legal standpoint, the separations that we have today make a whole lot of sense. So first degree murder, typically, kind of like I said, requires some intentional killing that is willful and premeditated with malice aforethought. So that means that malice aforethought is typically demonstrated by showing that the person had this premeditated plan to harm someone ahead of time. That then is separated from second degree murder, which, like the quintessential second degree murder example to me is like a bar fight gone wrong that results in somebody's death. It's not premeditated or planned, still doesn't make it okay, obviously, right? It's still murder, but we can understand like intuitively the separation behind these things. I guess if I can say one thing about the legal field and the way the legal field has evolved, I think it's important that people understand that the United States has largely inherited its legal system from British common law, from principles that come out of British common law. And then we built this legal system slowly over time through both the statutory law, so like what's actually written by lawmakers, by legislators, and then through judicial decisions, which is like judicially created law. So a lot of times people view judicially created law as like, oh, those darn activist judges. In reality, and I can completely understand why people have that about certain decisions, but in reality, judicially created law has always been a core component of the judicial system and the criminal justice system in the United States. Ideas like Miranda rights, those are so named because they came out of a case the United States Supreme Court decided named Miranda. And so those Miranda rights exist and become part of the system. So I guess what I would say is my defense of the legal field and its justifications is that the legal field, even though it's not perfect, obviously no system is, has evolved tools to address kind of these intuitive things that we feel as humans. We know that it feels different to lose a family member in a bar fight gone wrong than it does to lose it to like a premeditated like serial killer, the way that we would think about like a typical first degree murder case. And then it gets even more, we get lower degrees of free will further down the track. So when we move then to voluntary manslaughter, that's often someone has chosen to kill someone, but they've chosen it, I would say, overshadowed by some like some emotional trigger or some type of understandable circumstance. And when I say understandable, I don't mean that it like justifies the murder. That's then when we get to like self-defense. I mean that they've like the quintessential example of like third degree murder or voluntary manslaughter is like husband comes home, finds wife cheating, and it's an understandable reaction. At least this is the thought, in days gone past, that's going to cause a certain response in someone, and that result could include violence. Still not okay, still a criminal act, still something that people would go to prison for, but it's more understandable than first degree murder, which is like, premeditated killing of somebody. Then involuntary manslaughter is like you made a bad choice because you breached some duty you owed somebody, but you never had the intention anywhere along the track to actually kill someone. You never had the affirmative, you never made any type of affirmative decision to kill someone. Instead, this is like someone's, drinking and driving. And as a result of the drinking and driving, which again is not okay, but they did not make a conscious decision to kill someone. More like negligence is usually understood as like accepting a risk that can happen to other people by breaching that duty. And so you kind of accept as a consequence of drunk driving that you may kill someone, but it is different than, deciding at some point, even in the throes of passion, to kill someone. So I don't know if that was super muddled or if that was super helpful or if there were other parts that you were hoping I would hit, but I think I would just, go ahead.
Well, I just want to ask the question, is it fair to say that in your opinion or your estimation that the legal system is basically trying to line up its crime and punishment to the degree of free will that we perceive people having in a various case? Like is it fair to say, first degree murder, we're saying, well, the reason we think that's so bad is because you exercise the most amount of free will, therefore you carry the most responsibility. And then as we come down the chain, well, less free will was engaged at the second thing, so we'll hold you a little less responsible. Mm-hmm. And we kind of go right down the chain. Third, well, even less free will because you were emotionally disturbed, you had a very fast time, you weren't able to engage as much, we'll hold you even a little less responsible, right? So to me, the notion of compatibilist free will, that it's a degree of free will, is reflected in our court system, and it's a good thing that we do that, because it more accurately reflects reality. And I just want to see if that's a fair way of looking at it. The amount of free will is directly proportionate to the crime.
Yeah. Yes. I would say that maybe in legal circles, we're not as concerned with the free will question. It's almost like that's a deeper question. It's like it's presumed that we have free will, but where this gradation really comes from is the question of intent. How intentional was the harm that you caused? And intention, I think, does go hand in hand with free will. So I just don't think in legal scholarship circles they would use the term free will. They probably are going to be looking at it as intent. But I think, yes, I agree with everything else you said, just with that slight little tweak maybe in the way that legal people talk about it. The other thing I would say is that not only do I think it makes a lot of sense, I think what I'm trying to say is oftentimes the solutions that the legal field finds to problems come out of our natural intuition. So we know instinctually that there's a huge difference between the circumstances we just talked about in a first degree murder case and in an involuntary manslaughter case. We know that intuitively. And so the distinctions that the legal system has built come after we recognize that intuitive difference.
Yes. Yeah. That we know that this person deserves more culpability because they engaged longer. They're conscious, they premeditated it. And so we're like, oh, you thought about this for a while. We're going to hold you more responsible than somebody who just in the moment of passion, they went off the rails, even though the outcome's the same, even though the outcome in the same case, somebody got shot and killed. We recognize that free will matters, that, the premeditation matters, the ability, your emotions, that degree matters. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get at, is that not only is it a philosophical thing, it's a real world way. It's important to think about these things, I think, rather than in that kind of abstracted metaphysical sense, because we're trying to do the best we can as humans on the planet and make sense of things. So
exactly. No, I think that's such a great example to show that.
All right, so I kind of want to wrap this up or move towards wrapping up, where we talked about consciousness, right? And so this is also tied into freedom evolves. And so Dennett makes the case that consciousness largely evolved alongside capacities for free will, that these two things are closely interrelated. So that in the same way that like consciousness, I used the inebriation example before, right? So when you're inebriated, like you're drunk a little bit, well, that impacts both your consciousness, right? It changes the way you feel and interact with the world, but it also impacts your free will and your decision-making processes, right? So it's examples of degrees, both of how your consciousness feels to you, and you can have all sorts of examples of how consciousness changes and how free will changes, and these things totally interrelate very closely.
Right.
So then I also wanted to talk very briefly about a lot of times the question for the incompatibilists is like, well, where is the indeterminate? Where is the choices actually there? If it's all stitched up behind you, it's just playing out. And the idea behind this is, well, actually there is an indeterminate interface, and that is your future. Your future is always, from your perspective, indeterminate. You don't have Laplace's demon's knowledge of the future. So to you, you don't necessarily know what your outcomes are. This gives you sufficient indeterminism for you at least to be making these choices, right? And let's read this little quote here, I think, because it weighs that out.
It says, the task of the mind is to produce future, as the poet Paul Valery once put it. A mind is fundamentally an anticipator, an expectation generator. It mines the present for clues, which it refines with the help of the materials it has saved from the past, turning them into anticipations of the future. And then it acts rationally on the basis of those hard-won anticipations. Yeah, the way I've thought about this before, and again, it's just an analogy, but when I was a kid, the only sport I was ever good at, this might shock you, Troy, but I'm not a sports ball guy, but the only sport I was ever any good at was baseball. And when you start playing baseball and you start to learn the ways that a baseball is going to come off of a bat and either pop up in the air, or maybe it's, a grounder if you're playing on the infield, you kind of learn through past experience how to inform future events, right? You can understand and kind of gauge intuitively where a ball is going to go and the ways it's likely to proceed. And I think that just gives a good model to like think about the way we can view these things. Like that's what's going on behind the scenes in our mind. Like we know that the human brain is a pattern recognition machine, an overactive pattern recognition machine, I would say. And so that's kind of naturally what it's doing. But you're right that this does give us that indeterminate that we need for compatibilism.
Right. So that we're always thinking about potential futures, even though they may not play out because we choose to do something else or whatever was happening. This is what Hume used to call, what did he call them? Hypothetical liberties. That the different things that might appear in the future are all hypothetical. We consider our hypothetical liberties, the different things we could do, and then evade some and choose to do others.
Absolutely. Okay.
All right. So kind of how free will, then I think we've done a pretty good job of tying these together, but just to kind of sum up.
Yeah.
So this then ties into moral and personal responsibility, right? So if you have that capacity to model futures for the accurate cause-effect relationships, I think we can say, well, you do have the ability to respond then personally and morally based upon how accurate your capacity is for that. Which I guess is the next point that I said, right?
Right.
Yep. All right. I get to wrap up here because I get to do my Neil Peart stuff. Neil Peart is the drummer of Rush, who's now passed away, unfortunately. Rush is back out on tour. I will see them in December. So,
awesome.
Or not December, October. I'll be there in October. Sorry. October.
That'll be awesome.
Yeah. New drummer, a female drummer, Annika Niles. Anyway, I really appreciated Peart's take on things because he's kind of a bit of a philosopher in the lyrics he wrote. So I'll just go ahead and read this because then you've got some stuff with Christopher Hitchens here. Right.
Sorry about that.
Oh, did we? Oh, I can still see, but maybe your screen.
Oh, okay.
There.
Perfect.
Okay. Anyway, so this is from a song called Free Will that Rush put out. Neil Peart is the lyricist. So here's some of the key lyrics. He says, There are those who think that life is nothing left to chance, with a host of holy horrors to direct our aimless dance. A planet of playthings, we dance on the strings of powers we cannot perceive. The stars aren't aligned, or the gods are malign. Blame is better to give than receive. Position of free will. But then he, comes around and says, well, you can choose a ready guide in some celestial voice. If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. You can choose from phantom fears and kindness that can kill. I will choose a path that's clear. I will choose free will. And I kind of like this whole, I will choose free will. It reminds me of the Matrix or something, where you're like, well, I'm going to make this conscious choice in favor of believing in free will because of the value of the impact for it in my life. Mm-hmm. I always kind of like that. I will choose to believe in free will by my own free will.
Right. No, I think it goes back to the utility we talked about in believing this. So obviously, when we're talking about like fallacious arguments from consequences occur when we say because of good consequences or because of the lack of bad consequences, this thing is objectively true. I think there is an entirely separate case to be made for. So I do believe compatibilism is, quote unquote, true, that it's a justified belief. But even if you didn't, I think there is a good utility, practically based, pragmatic argument, kind of like you opened with, to say, this is probably the model that we should be teaching because of that study that we talked about. And I think there are other studies that help show that there are deleterious societal effects to teaching people that they do not have free will, when really, if we can invite people to think about free will in a slightly different way, you can square it with what science basically shows today. And yeah, I love Rush. And two, I love that you ended with those lyrics. I think it's great. I just had one last little thing I was going to share. So folks know that I'm a pretty big fan of Christopher Hitchens, one of the other four horsemen of the new atheist movement, along with Dennett, that we've been talking about. And I always kind of liked his pragmatic answer to the question of, do we have free will? He basically says in this clip here that he believes we have no choice but to have it.
Is there free will? The believer will say yes, because we've been given it. Of course there's free will. The big guy says so. Who am I to disagree? Well, that seems to me to be absolutely self-cancelling nonsense. If I say, my answer when I'm asked is there free will? I say, yeah, I think there's free will. We have free will. We have no choice. At least I know I'm being ironic. The people who say,
so I like the way he says that, just because, as a fan of irony and just as pointing out, these are hard questions, and there are, I think, really simple answers if we're just able to shift the explanation off. Like he says, of course we have free will. The big guy says so. I just love the way he puts that. Even though his takes on some of this stuff probably isn't as sophisticated as Dennett, I do think kind of that pragmatism behind his answer. Of course we have free will. We have no choice but to have it. Yeah, I think there is a very good utilitarian case to be made for compatibilist free will on top of everything that you've shared with me today. Troy, thank you so much for putting all of this material together. I think it was wonderful. Helped me learn a little bit about Futurama, and I really like that clip. So maybe I'll have to check it out. I've heard for years that it would be a show that I like and just have never gotten around to watching it. Do you have any other concluding thoughts you want to share about our free will and fun times that we've had today?
Well, I just want to say that I really appreciate you having me on the channel to speak about this. I do think that this compatibilist notion of free will isn't the sort of thing that you grasp right away. You kind of have to spend some time thinking through these difficult topics. And so because it's a little more involved and engaged, I'm like, thank you, Kolby, for letting me come on and walk through some of these ideas rather than just getting into those quick kind of back and forth things that happen in comments and stuff, or those very shallow discussions. So thank you. That's the main thing I want to say is thanks for this opportunity.
Oh, no, thank you for being willing. And you are welcome here anytime to talk about interesting things. Do you have anything you want to point people to if they're interested in following you or your work?
Not really at the moment. I mean, I do have my own channel, but it's not very active. I used to do a lot of stuff mostly on video games, but I did do some things on morality and free will. I've been thinking about coming back, but I like having these discussions with a live person more than just doing my own little thing. So I don't know. Maybe I'll be doing the circuit and talking to people on more channels.
That'd be great. Well, you're great at it, and thank you for everything you presented today, folks. Thanks for joining us on today's episode of Let's Disagree and other interesting conversations. Please like and subscribe to stay tuned in for more conversations like this. We're really trying to create a space where we can have these types of conversations. And for anyone who feels that we've misrepresented their position as an incompatibilist, or if there's something that we've missed, I would also be interested in kind of hearing the opposite side of the coin. I think Troy did a great job of going right to some primary sources from Sapolsky and Harris, but I'm sure anytime we talk about contentious issues like this on these big questions, there are people who feel like, hey, you guys didn't get that right. And more than willing to sit through and have an interesting conversation or disagreement on that kind of view as well. So otherwise, please stay tuned here, and thanks for joining us.